Yes.
And
Right.
and next we get to introduce Kyle Lewis from Research Data and Communications Technologies to talk about RAF and VROs.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, I'll move to presentation mode. And hopefully you all can see this. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Kyle Lewis. I'm the security officer for NIAID's International Biological Resource Support Program, or the IBRSP. And we're basically the international team for NIAID that does IT services and cybersecurity for a number of international research labs and also virtual research organizations in the cloud. On behalf of our team, I'd really like to thank all the organizers who put together this summit. It's a tremendous amount of work, especially for making room for us to present at the last moment. I'm glad we're able to show our journey over the last year because earlier presentations yesterday alluded to this work and really set the stage wonderfully. So on that note, today we're going to talk through our story with identity assurance since we presented at this very conference last year. Last year, we started looking at how do we get an authority to operate an ATO, which led to some interesting trails along the way in the federated landscape that we operate in. And so I know not everyone here works in a government system, but an ATO, an authority to operate, is what we need from a senior level government official called an authorizing official, who the authorizing officials are the only ones who can accept risk on behalf of the federal government and approve a system to operate in cyberspace on the network. So that was our journey over this last year, and we were just at the beginning of that when we presented. Now, many of you already probably know who we are, so I'm not going to have a lot of slides introducing us, but just to recap, I said we're the international team, and really I'm going to talk about our journey with our US federal cloud-based system sitting on Amazon Web Services. And so yesterday, Brett Bieber gave a wonderful presentation introducing, the ideas of the Federation InCommon that we're a part of, and EduGain, which is the broader international Federation of Federations. And so what we do in our AWS environment is we host research applications and we federate users, researchers, and scientists from all over the world on behalf of NIAID to conduct research. And so did a quick count before this presentation, but we have over 4,000 registered users around the world accessing our systems. So we're bringing a lot of people together. So as I alluded to, this time last year, we were at the beginning of working through all our controls and trying to write a system security plan. And it's a long process to get to an ATO and get the authorizing official to sign and accept risk. So in the journey towards the ATO, we had to consider cybersecurity from a federated perspective. And when bringing in international partners, the rules and practices do not all neatly fit into the United States government NIST framework. So this shows three dimensions that we developed along from multi-factor authentication in the Federation, implementing the certified framework that Brett alluded to yesterday, which was the cybersecurity incident response framework in the Federation. And then also the identity insurance. How are we sure that our users coming in, when they got their network credentials from their own organizations, the identity assurance was at a level that the US federal government and our authorizing official specifically, it was prepared to accept. And this is what this presentation is going to focus on. So getting back into the thicket of all the NIST guidance, the US government guidance. So one of the things we had to solve in our system security plan was achieving the requisite IAL level, or the identity assurance level. So in NIST accreditation, everything starts with the information itself. It's what are you housing on your system? How sensitive is it? What happens if someone gets access to it that shouldn't? So confidentiality is violated, or integrity or availability. And based on this information that we host for our system, we worked through the guidance. And so, I just showed an example of one of the decision trees on the right. And we needed IAL2. And if I remember from yesterday, one of the audience members asked Brett, how does the REFEDS Assurance Framework meet IAL2? So that was a perfect fit up because that was the exact question we were wrestling with over the past year. So as I alluded to, my partner researchers, they don't follow NIST. What about external users from an international partner's perspective? So we needed to find a method of reasonable equivalence. We had to convince our authorizing official to accept risk. And the going in position is, if we were going to expect the letter of the law, research would stop. And I think that's, it's the first takeaway for everyone here who's grappling with the same thing. If your information assurance staff requires the letter of the law, it's not going to work in the federated environment. But there are levels of reasonable equivalence that at least one, if not two, authorizing officials have accepted, which was not true a year ago. So why do we look at REFEDS? NIAID through NIH, we're part of InCommon, and hence we federate with the partners within InCommon and the broader educating community. NIH has signaled to InCommon over a year ago now that several of the REFEDS frameworks, from MFA, multi-factor authentication, to identity assurance, is going to become an important part of how the National Institute of Health grants access to its data. So obviously that sent ripples throughout the community. But even more interesting, just last week at the InCommon Camp and ACamp conference, the chief of Identity and Access Management presented to InCommon that the target date for, and it is a planning date, it's a target date. He didn't say it was a hard date, but he did say this time next year, basically December of 2022, was when they would be looking at starting to require some of the REFEDS identity assurance to be signaled in the federated login assertions when institutions log their users in. So we looked at the RAF identity assurance profiles, which is a part of the assurance, as a logical bridge of how we might articulate to our own boss why this could compare with NIST guidance. But there was a challenge, because REFEDS bridges through a lot of different nations. That's the international framework. And so different nations have different ways of solving things. So we started at the first logical place, which was to go to the website. Now the right side is a summary graphic that I put together, kind of showing what the identity level profiles are. So the red, the yellow, the green, and what are their source criteria. So I can signal IAP high if I'm an identity provider and my user is coming to your agency, your service provider. I can signal IAP high if my identity, my network credential issuing process to check the identity of that user meets Kantara, which is a set of criteria, assurance level 3, and it calls out specific paragraphs. Or IDAS is the European standard. If it calls out, if you've implemented those paragraphs or something equivalent to those paragraphs, then you can claim high. And it's an or statement. You can claim medium if you're a Kantara assurance level 2, or you're using the interoperable global trust federation documentation at the Birch or the Cedar level, according to the way they define it, or IDAS low. So the first interesting thing is not everybody's 3-tier system matches up with each other. We see that you have to get to IAP medium, IDAS, or sorry, the lowest IDAS level, low, gets you to IAP medium. The other thing is, we don't know if someone signals to us high, for example, we don't know if their institution implemented the Kantara paragraphs, which is based on old NIST guidance, the 63-2 series, which has been deprecated, but it's older NIST guidance, or if they've come through it through the IDAS method. And so in our gap analysis, we had to look at each one and basically take the combination of gaps to say, this is what we can't be sure of. If they're signaling me high, what am I sure of? What am I not sure of? And so the other thing that I learned at the beginning of this journey is talking to some of the authors of the original framework. They have explicitly said they're not making a claim that these 3 are equivalent. So Kantara is not necessarily equivalent to IDAS, but what they are saying is if you achieved either one of those, you're allowed to claim high. But you couldn't say, hey, if I'm Kantara AL3, I could go into the European system and I could claim IDAS directly. They would actually have to accept IAP high. So to start, in looking at RAF, we also had to understand how it related to our current 863-3 specifications across the identity assurance level spectrum. The logical bridge point was, of course, the Kantara specs, because they were based on older NIST guidance. So at least it was apples to apples there. But as we started going through this, and I'm sure those of you who have worked through the NIST guidance have realized this too, in the current setup, there is a huge difference between IAL1 and IAL2. You go from self-asserted, I don't really need any proof other than to prove that I'm a living human being, to I need a piece of superior evidence or two pieces of strong evidence and a piece of weak evidence. And there's this big chart and this big calculator, and the person getting the credential has to prove their identity through a combination of documents. So the practical world, most implementation actually falls somewhere between IAL1 and IAL2. So again, we're not going to go through all of this, but just as a visual example, we got out our highlighters, we printed copies, we drew lines and notes all over the various source texts that were quoted. And the goal was to see what the gaps were between what we could deduce IAP high could claim versus what IAL2 asked for. And I just started with, I need IAL2, so I started with the highest that REFEDS has to offer. Let's see if we can prove that first and then work down. And so we did this for each of the IAP levels. And so we made placemats just like what you see, and we color-coded areas that either did not meet the letter of the NIST requirements, or in the case of the European guidance, the blue text, were an interpretive stretch, because I actually like how the European guidance approaches it. They will state things like, is the document checked against a nationally authoritative source or something that's recognized nationally, but they leave it up to that country to interpret what that means. That makes sense because not all countries solve things the same way. So when we did this, we were able to illustrate a qualitative comparison between the various source criteria and how the REFEDS Assurance Framework groups them. So you can see the IAP levels in the bar. And we found that IAL2 almost, but not quite reached by what IAP high can claim. So by the letter of the law, IAP high doesn't quite reach IAL2, but it's very close. Now, conversely, if you're an identity provider in the Federation and you're already working with the US government and you're already at IAL2, you could implement REFEDS and signal REFEDS IAP high today and just go about your merry way without putting any more thought into it. However, so when we got in front of our authorizing official, we were able to articulate this and say, hey, we have a few extra mitigating measures. It's not like anyone in this Federation can log into our system. We also have a user registration process of our own, and it's an invitation-only process, and they're invited in by a principal investigator who's been given some grant money, who's gone through a process. So we were able to convince them to accept this. And this is how we felt when the ATO was signed. A huge amount of work. This time last year, didn't know if the risk was going to be accepted. And it was in a way that he was comfortable with. So what did we learn along the way? Well, the service provider has a perspective. And we were doing this as a service provider. We had the data that people were trying to access. Perspective is we're assuming the risk. We're letting an outside user access our data. Now, NIST makes it easy to determine which level of assurance we require because it gives us guidance as you're doing research data and you go through the process and it's okay, moderate risk, and you need IAL2. But if you're looking at the REFEDS, even for a US government perspective, it requires some kind of translation to map the requirements. The identity provider has a different perspective. Their perspective is how easy is REFEDS Assurance Framework to implement? How easy is it to understand? Am I already doing it with my existing business processes? What does my service provider require? If the IDP knows they need to achieve medium or high, if they go to the webpage right now, it's a little daunting to determine if their existing user registration process meets their criteria and where they might have to tweak their process. So in doing this work, I talked to some of the REFEDS working group folks, and then the next thing I knew, that I was like roped into being part of their team, which was actually a good and a fun thing. It's probably the most fun thing I've done this year. But the REFEDS Assurance Working Group started talking about how do we distill down what we're actually asking for instead of pointing people to a buffet of different source criteria. What are the RAF IAPs in spirit? And this is a simplified cartoon. If you assume an in-person registration process, you know, IAP low, you're a living person, come on in, here's an account. IAP medium, you have a government ID, it has some anti-tamper techniques, maybe a hologram, it has a picture I can look at your face, it looks like you. Okay, and I trust, you know, this reasonably looks like a good ID to me, come on in. And then IAP high is that, plus I'm able to go out and validate your ID with a nationally authoritative or similarly authoritative source. So this is how that distills down. So where are we going from here? So our team, we are all into this, to REFEDS Assurance Framework as a contributing member, because we want to make it easier for service providers to understand what the risk criteria is in order to make risk decisions, and they can decide what IAP levels they want to accept, whether or not you work for the government or not. If you're in InCommon, REFEDS is going to become more and more widely adopted. So you probably need to understand, if you're a service provider, and you're going to start receiving signals from your IDP, the IDPs federating into your system, what should you ask for? And but just as importantly, we want identity providers to be able to understand what's being asked, because we want it easier to adopt, because if no one implements it, it's not useful. And so on that note, that concludes my presentation. As just alluded to, this is part of kind of a three-pronged approach we did this year on weirdness with international federations in the US community. But if anyone is interested in these slides or talking more about this, my contact information is on the lower right. And at that time, I think try to get back into Zoom so I can see the Q&A. There we go. It's open to any questions. No open questions, okay. Okay, there's a question. Did you analyze where HSPD 12 stood in REFEDS? No, we did not. I'm actually not familiar with what HSPD 12 is. So I think you just gave me
PIV cards, IAL, which is IAL3 and AAL3, right? Is that the context of HSPD 12?
I don't see any amplifying question, but if that is in fact IAL3, REFEDS Assurance Framework does not achieve that. REFEDS Assurance Framework achieves at best IAL2.
Yeah, so the way we looked at it, any government IDs, any user coming in from using a federal ID like a PIV card to authenticate into our system far exceeds what our identity assurance and authentication assurance process requires currently. So the other thing too is that, you know, that's what on the IAL side, that would also meet or exceed what the MFA, the REFEDS MFA profile requires as well. Because to use an HSPD 12 credential requires multi-factor authentication. And in fact, in our view, we don't see how you could have higher levels of assurance without also having higher levels of authentication assurance. We see identity and authentication assurance being inextricably combined.
Mhm.
And it goes to, how strongly you can prove that the incoming digital identity is actually bound to that person. It's almost like a chain of evidence. One part of that chain is checking their identity documents to whatever national standard. But then also you want to ensure that no one can misuse that proof, that legal proof of identity binding. And that's where MFA comes in. They really are two halves of the same thing.
I mean, let's say that you had a service that you wanted to federate and you needed to, for whatever reason, you needed to require HSPD 12, which a lot of government contracts and systems do have that kind of requirement. And some authorizing officials won't be generous in the way that they'll interpret this. So in those cases, you could lock those applications to only use IDPs from government institutions that are required to use HSPD 12. So for example, there's a number of government IDPs that are in InCommon, and then you can also do a bilateral federation with a IDP from an agency that is not in InCommon.
And I just reshared the spectrum that shows, as high as RAF, REFEDS Assurance Framework, does reach.
Right.
So if you're already at IAL 2 or 3, you're perfectly able to claim RAF high because you exceed the standards.
Yeah. Right. If you're a government IDP that's requiring all of your staff who are using your IDP to access external service providers, you would be able to assert IAP high, right, Kyle?
Correct. As long as they meet the requisite IL levels.
So I think we've beaten that question to death. Are there any others? Okay, I guess there are no more questions.
Either that or all your curious audience or very slow typists.
I doubt that that's the case in this community.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been really interesting.